Excellent. Welcome. What a fun class we had to talk about tonight. It's an area of Italy that we don't often focus on as much as we do what we call the big B's, right? We think about the collectible wines of Italy all the time, Super Tuscan, and then the B's, Barolo, Barbaresco, Brunello di Montalcino. So to focus on a region that has a reputation as both one of the most luxury-minded wines of Italy, as well as some of the most kind of quaffable, kind of innocuous, unsung wines of Italy as well, right? We think about the lakes and lakes of Pinot Grigio, IGT level that come out of here that you can find in gas stations and places like that. But these aren't really some of the regions we'll be talking about. Primarily, we're going to focus on three that I think really are the three that uphold the quality, the value of the Veneto region and what we should be focusing on. So as we've had a few more people sign in, just a reminder, chat amongst yourselves in the chat box, chat with others, ask questions, take yourself off mute if you'd like to, share what you're drinking. And then my favorite thing is, of course, share. If you've been to these regions, where did you stay in Venice? What was your favorite place to dine? Which wineries did you have the opportunity to visit? I've only been to one winery in the Veneto, and that was Zime. I went it must have been 2019, January 2019 to Italy, and I spent almost a week in Verona, studying with the Valpolicella education program. That was a lot of fun. So we learned a lot, and it feels like it's been a long time since that happened already. The three B's again, Brunello Barbaresco and Brunello di Montalcino. I'm going to put it in the chat. So Brunello, sorry, the third one, Barolo. You have Brunello there, sorry. So Barolo and Barbaresco are both coming from the Nebbiolo grape in the Piedmont region. So we're also in northern Italy. And then Brunello di Montalcino is the Sangiovese grape coming from Tuscany, just outside of the Chianti Classico region. All right. So, we'll talk a bit about the philosophy, of course. A couple of wines that we sent out through our partners at Leduc. If you had the opportunity to pick these up, if you're drinking something else, please let us know what it is. I didn't get these wines, so I'm drinking something on my own that I actually had just opened for dinner the other night, not even considering the class coming up. I still had half a bottle in the fridge, so here it is. It's perfect. But we're focusing on two wineries today. So one is very, very classic, and another one is newer on the scene of the Veneto region. So the first is Bertani. Bertani is a very classic Valpolicella and Amarone producer. It was founded in 1857 by the Bertani brothers. They spearheaded a campaign really to show the potential of Valpolicella and especially the Valpentena wine district that's located within it. The release of the Secco Bertani, Valpentena put the DOC on the map during that time as well. And in the 1950s, they were really one of the first, even though the Amarone style was really created in 1938. And if you're confused and you're like, what's the difference between Valpolicella and Amarone? Don't worry, we're getting there. So they were really the first to release a commercial style of Amarone della Valpolicella, which was the dry wine made from raisinated grapes. So they had traditionally released Recioto, which is a sweeter style of wine, red wine made from dried grapes. And then the Amarone release, although started in 1938, this commercial release was really one of the first coming from Bertani as well. They own property in neighboring Soave, as many of the producers in both Soave and Valpolicella do. Valpolicella is a red wine region only, and Soave is a white wine region only. They are adjacent, and many producers make wine in both, white from Soave and red from Valpolicella. The Soave that you're drinking today is 100% Garganega, the native grape of the region, which requires a minimum of 85%, but in this case, the producer is choosing to bottle it at 100%. And it's really fascinating. They pick, they have two picks for the Garganega grape. So why would a producer do this? So one, they would pick the grapes on the early side. This preserves a lot of freshness and acidity to the grapes. You get more of that kind of like white flower, kind of sharp green apple and citrus. And then going back and doing another pick a little bit later gives you grapes that have a riper profile to them. So in this case, you can blend those two styles and have a really balanced wine. They age the wine in concrete vats. We have gooseberry and peach and apricot, but still with a lot of fresh minerality. This is 2016, which is really cool for Soave. A lot of people say that Soave is not a wine to age, and there are oceans of very neutral, lower quality Soave that is made, but in the hands of the right producers, it has the same amount of ageability as any of the really important white wines of Italy that we think of. If you're drinking red tonight, we're having a Valpolicella Classico Superiore this evening. Again, we're going to get to all of these terms. So I know some of you have taken our Italy classes before, so we'll be repeating some of the information. But when we repeat information, I really think that it's because it bears repeating to remember the terminology that you see on the label that helps us be more informed purchasers and understand also where our money is going when we're buying these styles of wine. So this is a newer winery, started in 1993 by Alfredo Buglioni. He purchased a farmhouse with almost 4 hectares of vineyards and 2 hectares of olive groves in Valpolicella Classico. Keep the olive groves in mind. The first several vintages were consumed at home. Initially, the family were not winemakers. So when they inherited the vineyard and started growing grapes and making wine, they consumed the first few vintages at home. In 2000, they renovated the farmhouse and cellars, and they brought in a local enologist and began producing wine commercially. Diego Bertani is still with them today. This is a blend of 50% Corvina, 20% Corvinone, 25% Rondinella, and 5% Croatina. It's aged in Slovenian oak cask, 20% new, but Slovenian oak doesn't add a lot of flavor and aroma to wine the same way that French or American oak would. And you tend to get more of this beautiful red and black cherry, red plum, pomegranate, herb, black pepper. Valpolicella is a lighter wine than Amarone della Valpolicella. These are 2 different styles of wine made in the same area from the same approved blend of grapes, but the production method does craft 2 different styles of wine. So Valpolicella, if you don't see it with the term Amarone or Recioto, it's going to be a lighter, fresher style of wine. This is one of the really confusing things about Italian wine regions, is that you can have the region, right, Valpolicella, and then you have all of these different styles. And if you don't understand what the terms Amarone, Recioto, and so forth mean, then you might not know how to navigate these wines either on a wine list or at a wine shop. So that's what we're here for. Because Italy, if you, like I like to say, if you are the type of person that likes to know everything about a particular subject, studying the wines of Italy is probably not for you, because you will never be there. It's just impossible with the jumble of wine laws, the indigenous grapes, the appellations, and just the breadth of wine that they produce within Italy. So today we'll talk about the background and history, geography and climate, Italian wine law, classic regions. The top 3 that we're going to focus on will be Prosecco, Soave, and Valpolicella, although we will be touching on some of the other regions outside of the top 3. This is just a really great map. It comes from Fernando Beteta, who is a master sommelier, and he has a lot of these maps on his website. I can send that out tomorrow. If I forget, just let me know, because his maps are really fantastic. He's been crafting a lot of the new maps for the Court of Master Sommeliers for their certified and entry level certification. And they're fantastic because they give us an idea of the topography of the land And once we start understanding how plains, valleys, mountains, and bodies of water affect the growing of grapes and the making of the wine that's made from those resulting grapes, we really can look at this and start to understand the style of wine that we might expect, or where we want to go if we're looking for a specific style. So what this map also really does is, like, you see these two large bodies of water. We have the Adriatic, we have Lago di Garda, the largest lake in Italy. This is really a continental climate. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but you do have these moderating effects that you see here. But let's take a look at this just real fast. Prosecco DOC is an enormous area. It is a very large place of which grape can come from. Prosecco di Conegliano, Valdobbiadene is a much smaller area. So which of these do you think would kind of resultingly be the higher quality? Usually it's the smaller controlled area that is of the higher quality. Again, we can look here. You can see Valpolicella, the kind of pinkish purple area is all Valpolicella. Valpolicella Classico is a smaller area within the region. Valpintena is a smaller area within the region. And then you can see Soave over here as well. So Soave has also been expanded to be quite a large area, which is why we begin looking for these sort of Classico areas within the larger appellation that are kind of the historical heartland. So just a couple more maps to sort of orient ourselves, right? So where are we? We're in the northeast of Italy. Venice is the capital of the Veneto region. We're affected both by the Po River Valley, which is a plain. It's one of the really kind of the flat areas that you see in Italy. If any of us, sometimes I like to ask when I'm in person, because I don't have everybody's, screen up that I can see them right now, so I can see my presentation. But oftentimes I like to ask, have you been to Italy? Did you spend any time on flat land? And most of the time people are like, no, we were never, unless we were like literally in a city, but even if you went anywhere else, you were really never on flat land, right? It is an intensely mountainous country. But the fact that the Veneto does have this large plain is what allows for some of the mass production that we will talk about. And you can see that just on its own as well, the Veneto is a pretty large region within Italy. So, the history of Italy is far more involved than a few sentences on a slideshow. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about some of the individual history of the regions as we go through. But overall, we know that the ancient Greeks were here. They named it Enotria because of the wealth of vines. They were some of the first to begin to spread vines. There were grapevines here already. We know that grapes were cultivated before the Greeks and the Romans. But by the end of the 3rd century, the Romans began to really spread their empire throughout the peninsula. And with them, they took grapevine. And the Roman effect on the world of wine is still felt today, both where they went with those grapes and those grape growing techniques. They spread it all throughout, not just the peninsula of Italy, but all throughout Europe as well. They went as far as places like France and Spain and Germany. They were the first to adopt a lot of the winemaking techniques that we still use today. That could have been separating white and red grapes, things like trellising the vine, exposing the grape varieties to air so that we wouldn't have issues with rot or mold, exposing the leaf canopy to sunlight to encourage better ripening and photosynthesis of the grapes. They were the first to use closures on the wine, glass bottles, cork, and so forth. So they really had a huge impact on the world of wine even today, but especially in Italy. And they came to the region of the Veneto, and they were planting vines and growing grapes in this region as well. The Roman Empire had more or less fallen by the 6th or 7th century AD, or the Common Era. Italy, we fast forward quite a ways. Italy during the time between the 6th century of the Common Era and 1861, Italy was really this kind of like hodgepodge of kingdoms and fiefdoms and different cultures and languages and customs, right? And they really sought to unify the peninsula of Italy under a single crown. So this began to happen in 1861. And even today, you know, if you go to Italy, that every one of the 20 kind of states or regions of Italy really has its own cuisine. It has its own culture. It has its own wines and grape varieties that they produce within the region. And the way that they interact with the world is very different too, right? Puglia in the south is very different than how the area Lombardy around Milan interact with the world. In 1963, we introduced the DOC system. So the DOC system is an appellation system that covers and governs how grapes are grown and wine is made within Italy. We're going to get to more of this as well. So this system was introduced in 1963. This is later than some of the other European countries. For example, France began to introduce their system in the 1930s. And the DOC system is based on the appellation system that was developed in France. Post the creation of the DOC system, not every producer in their respective region was happy with the laws that governed how they could grow grapes and make wine. So there were producers who began to break off from the system and declassify their wine to simply as wine of Italy, right? Instead of being something like Chianti Classico or Tuscan. At the time, you couldn't even do Tuscan wine. It had to be like Chianti Classico or Brunello di Montalcino, right? So they decided to break off and start releasing their wine without an appellation or without a more structured indication of where the grapes and the wine were coming from. So in 1992, we introduced some reform in what's called Goria's Law. And this introduced the concept of the IGT, which is a larger growing region with more relaxed rules of production. So a really great example is today we're talking about the Veneto. The Veneto is the larger IGT area with a lot of allowed grape varieties, a lot of allowed production methods of wine. But then you start to get down into, when you saw that kind of original map, the smaller areas of production. And as the areas of production get smaller, not only are the geographical boundaries smaller, but also the rules in each of those regions regarding what grape varieties you can use, how you can grow your grapes, and how you can make and when you can release your wine become more strict. In 2008 to 2011, the seat of power that governed the DOC and DOC just system switched from Rome to Brussels for the kind of the EU, the overall EU umbrella that oversees the production of wine in all of its member countries, right? So there was a huge rush of appellation that went to ask to upgrade their respective regions from IGT to DOC or from DOC to DOCG. It's kind of like a ladder. You can climb the rung. As long as you've been following the laws for long enough, you can apply for an upgrade after a certain amount of time. So by 2011, a lot of increases were made in terms of who was now DOCs and DOCGs, but not all of them were necessarily done because the quality was the best in each of these regions. Today, Italy is the largest exporter of wine into the US. They produce a lot of wine, and a lot of it comes from the Veneto. What's the #1 sparkling wine by volume in the entire world? It is Prosecco. They make a lot of it. So in regard to the Veneto, it is overall a continental climate with kind of cooler winters and warmer summers, but it is moderated both by the Adriatic on the eastern side and also by Lago di Garda, the largest lake we mentioned before. It provides a maritime influence to the wine growing region closest to it. And it's the only place in northern Italy where we actually see olive trees. So, you know, a lot of times we talk about the kind of like the olive and butter line in Italy. It's somewhere like between like Rome and Tuscany, right? And it's this idea that in the south, the main fat is oil coming from olive trees, and in the north, the main fat is butter coming from animals because they don't have olive trees. But this is a climate where close enough to Lake Garda, you do see olive trees. So you see a little bit more of this maritime or slightly Mediterranean climate. The Dolomites are in the north. You saw that from that topographical map. They really help shelter the region from the cold northern wind, and it creates this network of valleys, right? And this is really what planted a lot in like Prosecco and Valpolicella are these valleys, these fingers that come down from the foothills of the Dolomites. As you can imagine, there's a huge mix of soils. Limestone is actually the older soil type in the Veneto, where volcanic is the younger soil type. There's a lot of volcanic soils within Italy, sort of a chain, a spine of volcanoes, the Apennine Mountains that run down the center of Italy. A lot of these volcanoes are dormant, they're no longer active, but of course, places like Sicily and a lot of the islands, we do see active volcanoes still. And at the base of the Veneto is one of the flattest parts of Italy. So we have the Po River Valley, and you can just plant grapes and get really, really high yields off of them. One of the issues with this is that when you have higher yield, you usually don't have as concentrated and flavorful of wine. So this is kind of where we get the joke of the idea of like, we sometimes say that like Pinot Grigio, especially coming from like IGT Veneto, it's kind of like the iceberg lettuce of wine, right? Like it's crisp and it's easy, but it's kind of neutral, and it's not really the lettuce that has the most flavor to it, right? You want a lettuce with a lot of flavor, you're going to pick something like arugula or escarole or radicchio, right? Where kind of the joke is that Pinot Grigio is the iceberg lettuce of wine. Of course, that doesn't mean that there are not great examples of Pinot Grigio made, and there are. When it comes to Italy, a lot of the really high quality Pinot Grigio, though, we talked about coming from Friuli, the neighboring adjacent region to the Veneto. So the capital is Venice. It's the most significant of the three regions that comprise the area known as the Tre Venezi, which is Trentino Alto Adige, the Veneto, and Friuli. They produce more than any other wine in Italy. The reputation is lowered by this kind of ocean of the neutral Pinot Grigio and sparkling wine. The expansion of the DOC and DOC zones have come to incorporate inferior areas for wine production. And this has fueled a lot of criticism of the appellation system in Italy. And despite this, really kind of generally the margin of Veneto wines is very low, but it is home to some of the most famous and luxury driven wine, which of course is Amarone della Valpolicella. And you literally have every style that you could think of here. If you wanted to live out your life in a region that made every single style of wine, the Veneto is not a bad place to look. You can live in, a beautiful small town in the mountain, one of the small villages in Valpolicella, one of the rive or villages in, somewhere like Prosecco or Venice, right? Really fantastic. So if anybody's looking into seriously buying one of those like 9,000 euro houses that are ready to move into in Italy, let me know. I want to hear about your experience. So Italian wine law. So this is the appellation system modeled after the French AOC system. Appellation d'origine contrôlée is what it's called in France. At the top of the tier is the DOCG. So when you see the term DOCG on a label of wine, they're essentially telling you that this is the height of control and guarantee for Italian wine. So usually we consider the DOCG wine to be of the highest quality. Because of the expansion, sometimes this isn't always true, but you kind of take that one with a grain of salt. Beneath that, we have the DOC level. The DOC is one step down from the DOCG. There are far more DOCs than there are DOCGs in Italy. I think there's 76 DOCGs now, and there's more than something like 400 DOCs. So when I told you that you're never going to know everything about Italian wine, just imagine trying to memorize 476 DOCs and DOCGs, aside from everything else there is to know, like grape variety, production method, aging, and so forth. In 92, we created that subcategory, the IGT, Indicazione Geografica Tipica, kind of the same idea as the IGP in France, where it's a larger area with more relaxed rules of production. Vino di Tavola, or simply known as Vino today, is your kind of very generic table wine from Italy. It will just say Italy. It won't have a more pinpoint area of production on it. And these are the three terms I really like to discuss, because when I first started studying wine, and I would see all of these terms on a label of wine, and it's not always as easy to understand from a bottle of Italian wine who's the producer, what is the region, and what is the grape variety, not to mention what these other terms can add or tell the consumer, right? But when we do understand these terms, it tells the consumer a great deal. So Classico is the initial original heartland of an area. We're going to talk about three of them today. A Classico region within Prosecco. We're going to talk about a Classico region in Valpolicella and a Classico region in Soave as well. Because many of these appellations or the geographical boundaries have been expanded over time, these Classico regions have become their own DOCG or appellation, letting the consumer know that this was the original space that was renowned for this style of producing wine. So we'll get into that more. Reserva means longer aging. Anytime you see Reserva, it's an extended period of aging within that respective region. Each region has a different set of laws regarding how long that minimum aging needs to be. In Amarone, a Reserva wine is aged for a minimum of 4 years. So what we can always expect, and it doesn't mean that you have to go out and memorize for the 476 DOCs and DOCGs, or even more than that, right? I mean, that's like over 400 DOCs. So I don't even know the exact number, something like 400 something. So, and then the DOCGs, you don't need to go out and learn the actual aging time for the regular wines and the Reserva wines in each one of those. You just need to understand that when you see Reserva, there has been extended aging. And that means that some of the fresh fruit character to the wine has been stripped away and is replaced with a more savory, earthy, or tertiary character. And a lot of the time with Italian red wine, we start to develop, sometimes people say like a little bit of VA, like volatile acidity. That's that kind of like balsamic characteristic that you get to the wine. Like a little bit of like, in the best way possible, sometimes people say like slight nail polish or paint, and it's there to uplift the wine. When it's overwhelming, that's a flaw, right? But in small amounts, it really can add some complexity and some lift to the wine. And Superiore generally indicate a higher minimum of alcohol above the baseline for the region or the appellation as well. So Superiore is oftentimes used for a wine that maybe had a better year, a warmer year, resulting in riper grapes, resulting in a higher minimum alcohol. So if you see Superiore, and some Italian wine regions have Superiore built into the actual name of the appellation, but again, and you don't need to memorize which one is 11%, which one is 11.5% minimum alcohol, and so forth. Just keep in mind that when you're seeing Superiore, usually it's a half a degree, a half a percent, 1% elevated above the base minimum of the appellation. And that means probably a riper expression, a little bit higher alcohol, a warmer body to the wine, and usually a richer fruit profile than the baseline of the wine as well. I think that the triangle always helps, right? So Vino on the bottom, wine of Italy, very few restrictions, any grape varieties, any style of winemaking, but you can't really put very much information for the consumer on that, right? This is what you would find and you would drink at the kind of the grocery store in Italy. Those 1, 2, 3 euro bottle of wine, those are the Vino di Tavola. Can you guarantee that if you're spending 1, 2, 3 euros on a bottle of wine, even when you're in Italy, that the conditions for the workers are where they should be? I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that, but we're thinking about. And then we go up to the top of the pyramid quality, the least amount of wine made, typically made this way, usually smaller production, higher value, and the most restrictions for the wine as well. Okay, let's get into some talking about some regions here. Thanks for sticking with me with that. I think it really helps to really understand a baseline of how we assess quality and typicity in each country. So it really helps to learn a couple of things about the appellation system that tells you what you can expect in the bottle. So let's talk about Prosecco first. The number one wine produced by volume in the entire world. But that is a very, very recent thing within really the last like four decades or so. It really has skyrocketed to fame, to become one of the world's most popular sparkling wine. I think Prosecco is really misunderstood though. And I think in general, sparkling wines are really misunderstood by maybe a new wine enthusiast that doesn't understand the difference in between different styles of sparkling wine in production and how the wine is made, and how the grapes are grown or which grape varieties you use, right? How the sparkling wine, how the wine becomes sparkling, what grapes you use, where the grapes actually come from, but then also how the wine is made that really affects both the flavor, but also the price of the wine. Because who would, you first get into wine and you go into a wine shop and you're like, well, I can get this bottle of Prosecco for $12, or the cheapest bottle of champagne for $40, right? And you're like, well, what's the difference? These are both sparkling wines. What is the difference that drive the price, and is that price difference worth it? So we're going to look at how Prosecco is made versus champagne, right? They produce more than 1 million hectoliters per year of inexpensive sparkling, and it really has become a victim of its own success. But we, within the past 2 decades, are really beginning to, like, just really, I mean, barely even just 1 decade, have really begun to change the appellation so that producers can make better informed decisions once you understand what these different regions and subzones mean. Why did Prosecco become popular? Well, the spritz was created during the Austrian Habsburg occupation of Venice in the mid-1800s. The Bellini cocktail was christened by Harry Cipriani in Venice in 1948 of Harry's Bar. Prosecco really during this time becomes sort of this post-war Bella Vita in Italy, this period of resurgence and economic renovation after what's been a really difficult, really like almost 100 years for Italy, right? We have 2 world wars, we have phylloxera, if you're in the wine growing regions at the end of the 1800s, you have dictatorship. So during this Bella Vita period, we're really seeing this resurgence of of the economy, especially in northern Italy, that caught up much faster than a lot of the South. You see this resurgence of the economy and the culture, right, happening. The Bellini comes to America in 1970, takes the country by storm, and it gives most Americans their very first taste of Prosecco. Mimosas and Bellinis should be made with Prosecco. Can you make those drinks with something like champagne? You can. But one of the things about champagne is, and we'll talk about this production method in a moment, is that you have a lot more subtle aromas of this kind of brioche toasty yeastiness that you'll lose with the juice and fruit of peach nectar and orange juice, right? So I mean, really, you should use Prosecco for these types of drinks. Prosecco should be used for a spritz. If all you have is champagne, that's fine, whatever. But like you're mixing it with something else. You're mixing your sparkling wine with both a bitter and a sweet aperitivo like Aperol or Campari, go for the Prosecco. So the first Consortia Tutela, which is essentially the body that governs production within a region or that promotes the producers of a particular region or area, was created in 1962. The DOC for Prosecco and Cartese was granted in 1969. They were some of Italy's first. But this is where things get really confusing. And I think we'll begin to clear up some of the confusion here so we can move forward into how to choose good Prosecco, right? So even though there was an official DOC for Prosecco since 1969, the restrictions were not legally enforceable because of 3 reasons. The name Prosecco was used first to indicate a wine, a sparkling wine coming from Italy. 2, a grape variety. The grape variety itself was also called Prosecco. And 3, a production area. And you can't name a wine growing area after a grape variety. Imagine if we tried to name wine growing areas after Chardonnay or Cabernet Sauvignon. Like literally every place in the world would use those terms, right? Because we already know those terms, Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon. In Italy, you do see regions that will use a name of a grape variety in conjunction with the actual production area, but you'll never see it Barbera di Asti or Barbera di Alba, Barbera coming from the Asti region or from the Alba region, right? You would never call those regions just Barbera because that's also the name of the grape. Let me know if you have questions about that. I know there's a lot happening in Italy. So you really can't name a wine growing area after grape variety. So in 2009, we created a new DOC for Prosecco at that much larger area that you saw. And then the classic Prosecco area, what we kind of think of as the Classico area, but its historical name is Conegliano Valdobbiadene, is upgraded to a DOCG, and the name of the principal grape variety, previously also known as Prosecco, would change to Glera, which is a historical synonym for the grape variety. Prosecco wines must be made from a minimum percentage of 85% Glera. Most producers use 100. Glera is the main grape variety. The other grapes that can be used are a mix of other indigenous Italian white grapes, things like Pinot Nero, as long as it's vinified as a white. And then a few international grape varieties like Chardonnay can be used in small amounts. But most producers primarily use Glera. There are 4 styles that you'll see. The first is frizzante. It is a very slightly sparkling style of wine. So it's not as fully sparkling as something like Prosecco Spumante or Champagne or Franciacorta. It is sparkling at only 1 to 2.5 atmospheres or bars of pressure. Champagne is usually between like 5 and 6. Spumante is a fully sparkling Prosecco, so a minimum of 3.5 atmospheres of pressure up to 5 or 6. Tranquillo is a very, very rare style. I can't think if I've ever had one. It's a still Prosecco. So you can see them. Prosecco does not have to be a sparkling wine. As long as you're using the grape variety Glera, as long as you're adhering to the other rules of the appellation, the geographical boundary, and other laws like that, you can make a still wine. I'm sure there are producers who do this. It's probably not that much of an economic advantage for them because a lot of consumers who don't realize that you can make a Tranquillo or a still style of Prosecco would probably think that your wine has lost its bubbles, right? And then rosé as well. Rosé can also be made a minimum 85% Glera. I don't think I've ever had a Prosecco rosé. Again, something I haven't seen so much of. You make that rosé by adding 10 to 15% of Pinot Nero, which is the Italian synonym for Pinot Noir. So most Prosecco, this is another confusing thing. Most Prosecco is released as extra dry or dry. Those are on the sweeter end of a sparkling wine. So I have a little list for you over here. Most champagne is released as extra brut, which is between 0 to 6 grams per liter of residual sugar, or brut, which is 0 to 12 grams per liter of residual sugar. So most Prosecco is released as dry, which is 17 to 32 grams per liter of residual sugar, or extra dry, which is 12 to 17 grams per liter of residual sugar. We are beginning to see more Prosecco producers who are crafting wines in more of a brut style. And so you can see those traditional European terms for dosage, what we call the sugar level in sparkling wine, on a bottle of Prosecco. So just remember, extra dry and dry don't mean dry. Extra brut or brut nature or zero dosaggio all indicate the drier style of Prosecco. So is anybody drinking Prosecco? So how is Prosecco made? This is another big difference in the cost of Prosecco versus the cost of other styles of sparkling wine like Franciacorta or Champagne or even Cava. So Prosecco can be made in what we call the classic method or traditional method, which is how Champagne is made. But most Prosecco is produced in a method called the Martinotti method or Charmat. Some of you that are studying wine may have heard of the Charmat method before, which is essentially initially known as the Martinotti method. If you go to Prosecco, please don't ask producers if they're making it in the Charmat method. Ask them if they're making it in the Martinotti method. And this is because Federico Martinotti, the director of the Experimental Station of Enology in Asti, and Italian, developed and patented the technique of conducting the second fermentation in these large, pressurized, temperature-controlled tanks in 1895. 15 years later, French Eugene Charmat adopted the existing device called the autoclave. The autoclave was actually produced by a colleague of Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur was the scientist who recognized a lot of the relationship between sugar and yeast and fermentation, and also how to just like fermentation in general. So the autoclave technology was adopted pretty quickly by the enology school and perfected for the use of making sparkling wine in Italy around 1910. They had a lot of issues though, phylloxera, the world wars, economic depression. So the Martinotti method and the method of using these autoclave tanks, which you see here, didn't really become popular and common in the region until the economic resurgence of the 50s and 60s. You're beginning to see how the timeline is working out here, right? So what the autoclave does is it starts the second fermentation, which creates the sparkle in sparkling wines in these large pressurized tanks. Aside from different from what we call the traditional method, where that second fermentation happens inside of the bottle of wine that it's actually sold in, right? So just get a bottle of champagne. I always have one nearby. So this is a bottle of champagne, traditional style of producing sparkling wine. A still wine is made. A still wine is put into this bottle with a little bit of yeast and sugar. It's the perfect amount to create a second fermentation, which traps the bubbles inside of this bottle because it's closed, right? It also, because you have that yeast and sugar in the bottle, creating that second fermentation and that carbon dioxide, those bubbles that are trapped into the liquid, we also get more of that, what we call autolytic character. That's the yeasty brioche. Just walked into a bakery, there's yeast in contact with my wine, taste and flavor. You don't get as much of that in Prosecco because you don't have as much yeast in contact with the juice itself. So you're doing the second fermentation in these large tanks and then bottling it under pressure. So that makes sense, right? So the other thing that the autoclave does is well, one, it's much less expensive than hand riddling and disgorging or using a gyro pallet to disgorge all of these wines here. But it also, this autoclave really helps capture and protect the really delicate flavors of the Glera grape, which are like fresh spring flowers, right? Like white blossom and fresh apple and citrus. So really delicate grape variety. And if you look, next time you go out somewhere, if somebody has a glass of like champagne or traditional method wine and somebody has a glass of Prosecco, look at the color. The colors are so strikingly different. Prosecco is almost green, like a white wine, where a traditional method wine will be a little bit more like oxidative, sort of straw or golden in color. So take a look at that too. You can see producers who will utilize a production method called Charmat Lungo, where you can actually have extended aging with the yeast in these autoclaves. So you'll see a little bit more of that, that mature flavor begin to develop. And if you see the rifermentato in bottiglia, yes, that means that the wine has been re-fermented inside of that bottle and made in the traditional method. So in Prosecco, you can make wines both ways. It's allowed by both. Most producers make it in the Martinotti or tank method, but producers can make it in the traditional method. And you might see the rifermentato in bottiglia, or sometimes you might even see something like metodo classico or traditional method, or any of those terms that will also tell you that that's a traditionally made sparkling wine. So we have Prosecco DOC. This spans 2 regions. It's not just in the Veneto, it also crosses over the border into Friuli, 9 provinces, 556 towns. Most of the wine produced is non-vintage. It can be vintage dated if 85% of the grape come from this dated year's harvest. Well, maybe you want to explore a more serious style of Prosecco. Maybe you're going to Italy for a vacation, you're going to be in Venice, you're going to be in Verona. You want to drink the local wines of the region, but you want to make sure that you're investing in something of a little bit higher quality. So Conegliano, Valdobbiadene, Prosecco DOCG, or Prosecco Superiore DOCG are really the main regions that you want to look for. They're the same. I've heard different sources on it, so I put them both. So this is how you pronounce. So this is really difficult to pronounce, right? That's why I put a little a little graphic for you. Conegliano. So the GLI. And if anybody here speaks Italian, you can take yourself off mute and say it probably much better than I do. So the GLI is pronounced as like a Y, like a Y-E-E in Italian. So Conegliano, right? Conegliano. And then double consonant, you always produce both letters side by side. So Valdobbiadene. So you're pronouncing that B twice distinctly. Valdobbiadene. But that's not really easy to say. So I've heard from some sources, but most sources aren't updated from this, that they're changing that to Prosecco Superiore DOCG. I wasn't really able to find a lot of concrete information on what they're doing there, but I think that they're going to be the same. So this is the historical heartland of Prosecco production. The surface area is limited here by topography. It can't be expanded. Even within the last few years, the Prosecco appellation, the DOC, was expanded by another 3,000 hectares. This happens because there are producers that are outside of the DOC that are saying, hey, I have the same grapes, I'm making the same wine, why can't I use it too? So eventually over time, the boundaries do become expanded. But one of the benefits of the DOCG is that they'll never be able to expand because it's really limited by the topography. You have the Dolomite Mountains in the north. The DOC area itself is defined by the hills, which is why Conegliano Valdobbiadene is kind of this weird, interesting shape because it really follows the contours of the hill. Valdobbiadene is a village that's located on the western side, and Conegliano is a village that's located on the eastern side. They do have quite a bit different topography as well. Rive is another category that you might see, also created with the law change in 2009, which is a system of single village designation. So the Rive will appear on a label followed by a village name. So if you see Rive, again, you're thinking probably higher quality, more control, more of those grapes coming from a more singular terroir. So you'll see Rive with the name of the village, like Rive di Far Stoligo, Rive de Colbertaldo, and so forth. If you see Rive, it's always a Prosecco Superiore, DOCG, always made from grapes from one designated village or Rive. So think about the same kind of idea, like all the grapes are coming from Geoffroy Chambertin for Burgundy, right? Single village. They must be vintage dated. They have to be hand harvested. They have more restricted yield, tighter control over how the wines are made. There are currently 43 Rive. They can be made in either the Martinotti or the traditional or Metodo Classico. And then we also have the Cartesi subzone. So it's a Cartesi Conegliano Valdobbiadene Prosecco DOCG is what you would see on a label. And you can see, or maybe the other way around, Conegliano Valdobbiadene Prosecco Superiore de Cartesi DOCG. Go into the wine shop and ask for that. But if you just say Cartesi, I think that they get the idea too, because Cartesi is a legendary site. It's been long known as the Grand Cru Prosecco. The subzone of about 107 hectares. You can see this small area. It's in the west towards Valdobbiadene. It is a steep south-facing hillside. It's a big patchwork of vineyards with different micro terroirs and soils. But one thing about it is that the exposition really allows for the grape to bud early, but also have a long continuous ripening. So they tend to be harvested last, and this results in a lot of flavor development, really great ripeness into the wines. And because of this ripeness, Cartesi wines are traditionally released in the dry or extra dry style as opposed to brut. So we're starting to see some examples of producers releasing as brut because the drier styles are what are really popular on the global market. But traditionally Cartese wines are released as dry or extra dry. If you, an IGT wine may not use Prosecco on the label, either even to mention, indicate grape variety or region or anything like that. If it's an IGT wine, you cannot say Prosecco. You can list Glera as the grape variety, you can say Veneto, but you cannot say Prosecco. Okay, white wine. This is what I'm drinking. So this is This is the Auto Soave, made in stainless steel. I mean, it really was an accident that I had this open in the fridge. I wasn't even thinking about it when I opened it for dinner the other night. So Soave is one of the greatest white wine regions in Italy. Dante Alighieri said, the village is indeed Soave, but it's wine even more. Kind of a reference to the idea that people used to say the region would name Soave because it was so suave. I think that that's been disproven, but it's still kind of a fun concept. The grape varieties here are Garganega primarily, a minimum of 70% for the Soave appellation. Trebbiano di Soave, Trebbiano grape, and Chardonnay is allotted in some of these vineyards, some of these styles as well. Soave DOC, again, a really large area. If we're looking at the actual area of Soave, I mean, it's the big, everything in red can be released as Soave DOC. You can pick grapes here, you can pick grapes over here, you can pick grapes here, and you can blend them all together and you can call them a Soave DOC. This is why it's earned a reputation as Europe's largest vineyard. It really has been a cautionary tale, an example amongst Italy's expansion of their DOC and their DOCG regions. However, it is the principal and most important white wine zone in the Veneto. Just like Prosecco, there are oceans of kind of neutral Soave DOC wine released. But if we know how to begin to look for the higher quality wine, we can find better value, better flavor, and support producers who are also trying to make better wine. So a minimum 70% Garganega, which I mentioned before. There are 33 individual crus recognized in 2019. I think that number has actually increased since then as well. If we want to have better wine, what do we look for? Well, Soave Superiore. So Soave Superiore DOCG is a approved appellation in 2001. It covered wine from a specified subregion that can be listed as either Classico. So, I mean, look how far this has been expanded. This used to be Soave. Now all of this is Soave. So that's why we really need these designations that pinpoint where grapes are coming from. So here we have the Soave Classico region, the initial heartland. If you are growing your Soave grapes on a hillside, but outside of the Classico region, you can list your wines as Soave Superiore DOCG Colli Scaglieri. So this limits the production outside of the Classico zone, but to the hillside sites, which are considered to be superior to growing grapes on the plains. Usually have better ripening, better sun exposure, better acidity because of the more frequent shift in temperature between day and night and so forth. So usually we say that better quality grapes are grown on hillside as opposed to flatland. So Soave Superiore DOCG wines are aged for a minimum of 6 months. They may be called Reserva with a minimum of 1 year of aging. They will show more structure, more intensity of aroma and flavor than the DOC. There was a period where the Soave wine became a little like kind of over oaked and overmade because producers can choose to use new oak or not, but most producers are really pulling back from that style. So this is a style of wine that's made in stainless steel, but he does make wines in barrel as well. Oftentimes those barrels are not new or they're partially new. We're going to talk about some producers at the end here as well. Recioto di Soave, DOCG. This is a tradition, a style of wine that dates back to the 6th century. Recioto di Soave is produced from grapes that are dried 4 to 6 months in the same delimited geographical area as Soave. Oftentimes, they're affected by mufanobile. This is the Italian term in the region for botrytis or noble rot. Barrel fermentation is more common for the Recioto di Soave wine. Botrytis is encouraged by most producers. These are sweet, more luscious examples of Soave wine. So Recioto di Soave, because it's being made from grapes that have been partially dried, will always have much riper stone fruit and honey flavor to the wine. Because of that age, they'll oftentimes have like a kind of a little mushroom or like candied nut characteristic to the wines as well. So Recioto di Soave is a sweet style that can also be made as a sparkling wine. So Soave DOC and Recioto di Soave DOCG can be made as a spumante sparkling, but just Soave Superiore, either Classico or Colli Scaglieri, may not. And also the last thing I'm going to say, because I don't want to like keep you guys too far over, I know we're already behind on time, but we just have one major region to talk about, so we're doing pretty good here. So there are two very different soil types in Soave. The eastern part, I guess would be over here from the way I'm looking at it. The eastern part is volcanic and the western side is limestone. So the western side will produce styles of Soave that tend to be more kind of like white flowers, fresh fruit, floral, and the eastern side will, with the volcanic soils, would typically be more structured, more mineral driven, and a little bit more intense as well. So Valpolicella, you guys are probably all like, we're all drinking Valpolicella. We haven't talked about it yet. So the name means the Valley of Many Cellars, and this is a reference to the many cellars that the Romans kept within the region as well up until the 6th century. They occupied the area until the 6th century. It's been known as the Valley of Many Cellars since the 9th century. Historically, the wines are blend, and more than 80% of the production is exported. This is a very mountainous region. 75% of the area is mountainous. It's quite a large area, though, because of the mountains, the valleys, only 20,000 acres of the 74,000 acre appellation are actually planted. The majority of vineyards are on the west and south facing hills at higher elevations. Classico is in the far west. With Classico, the original heartland, you have Valpentana in the center, and that's surrounded by the larger DOC area. The Classico area is also divided into 5 growing regions that are defined by the valleys and the mountain borders. The reason that this is important is, one, because of where the grapes come from, but also where the wineries themselves are located. In regard to the production of Amarone. So you have Sant'Ambrogio, you have Valle di Fumane, you have Valle di Marano, Valle di Negrar, younger volcanic soil. The wines are elegant. San Pietro and Cariano is in the south, so you have fruitier styles of wine. Valpentana, further away from, in more of that continental area, further away from Lake Garda, is a cooler subzone. Amarone della Valpolicella from Valpentana will usually be lower in alcohol than Amarone della Valpolicella coming from the Classico area. So what are the grapes of Valpolicella? You've learned about so many grapes today, right? Glera, Garganega, Trebbiano di Soave. Now you're going to learn about 5 or 6 more. So all Valpolicella wines, and we're going to look at the individual appellations in just a moment, require a minimum of the blend to be 45 to 95% of the grape Corvina. 5 to 30% of the blend must be a grape called Rondinella, and the balance can be made up, if you so choose, of Corvinone, Molinara, or Soletta, and other suitable authorized grapes. I'm going to get to that in a second. So why is Corvina important? It is the star of the show. It's very well suited to pergola trellising, the style of trellising where the grapes hang overhead. That's the most common style of trellising and training in Valpolicella still today. It also goes through a very long, slow dehydration process. We'll talk about that in a moment. It brings a lot of fruit to the wine. Corvinone means the big Corvina. It brings spice to the blend. Rondinello brings a lot of floral notes. Molinara brings kind of color and ripe fruit and grace. It loves the sun and it gets very ripe. Sometimes I've heard people describe Molinara as almost like the Grenache of Valpolicella for what it adds to the blend. And then Osaleta is a really fascinating wine. It's an old grape variety that's been recently rediscovered. It has very hard skin, and the skin brings tannin structure and color to the blend. So I said a moment ago, let's talk about other suitable authorized grapes in a moment. This includes many other authorized indigenous grapes that you can use in small percentages, 5-10%, things like Croatina. Sangiovese is a grape that you can use in very small amounts in Valpolicella. I've never seen a producer who uses it. I'm sure there is, somebody does though. It is authorized. And then there are international grape varieties that are authorized in small amounts. Syrah, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc. Most producers are beginning to replace those international grape varieties in their blend and in their vineyards with Osaleta, because they were using those thicker skinned international grapes to add the color, the tannin, the structure. And now that we are rediscovering and replanting Osaleta, we don't have to. Zime, it's a winery that I visited just outside of Verona. They actually make 100% Osaleta. It's a declassified Veneto wine, because they can't call it Valpolicella because it doesn't have 45 to 95% Corvina. So even though the grape variety is authorized in small amounts, even though the wines come from the Valpolicella area and are made in the region, they do have to declassify. So what appellations are we looking at here? Here's another map that really, I think, shows the topography of the different areas of production in Valpolicella. The red area is the Classico, divided into the 5 subregions. Here in the center, we have Valpentena, and then Elisi over here on the eastern side. We won't get into it much today. So all of the wines, if it says Valpolicella, 45 to 95% Corvina with Rondinella, and you can add those other accessory grape varieties if you'd like. Valpolicella is a light, fresh style of Valpolicella wine. It is a red wine, minimum 11% alcohol. It's not made at all from dried grapes. So you have this really beautiful, fresh red fruit, red plum, raspberry, strawberry characteristic to it. It tends to be kind of peppery and like slightly herbal. I really, really enjoy the Valpolicella regular DOC wines. Oftentimes like Soave, we're like, oh, it's a larger area. Valpolicella is the larger area. But most producers that make, actually all producers that make Amarone also make some sort of Valpolicella. You can only use a certain amount of your production of what you grow for the production of Amarone. You can label your Valpolicella wine as Classico if the grapes originate in the Classico area, or Valpentena. So you can have Valpolicella, Valpentena, DOC, Valpolicella, Classico, DOC. A more limited area of production should signify higher quality. Valpolicella Ripasso, DOC. This is a more modern style. It's a local technique where you take freshly vinified Valpolicella DOC wine and you pass it or pour it over the skins of grapes that have been used to make Amarone. So we've already dried the grape for Amarone. We've already made the wine. We pressed the juice away from the skin. Now you have that pomace, the raisinated skins of the grape that you're now re-fermenting with this wine. So what does that do? It creates a style that's between Valpolicella and Amarone. It's not as rich and bold and heavy and alcoholic as Amarone, but it's not as light as Valpolicella. So it's a richer, fuller style, stylistically somewhere in between, with a minimum of 12.5% alcohol. You can have Valpolicella Superiore, will be a minimum 11.5% alcohol. Valpolicella Ripasso Superiore. You can also have Valpolicella Ripasso Classico Superiore. Yes, you can have those things together if the grapes have a higher minimum alcohol and if the grapes originated from the respective area. If you guys are confused, please interrupt me because I know that we're going through a lot here. Amarone della Valpolicella DOCG. This is created via the appassamento process. Amarone is fermented to dryness or near dryness. It has a minimum required alcohol of 14%. These are high alcohol wines. Oftentimes they're up to 16%. They're aged a minimum of 2 years before release. Reserva wines are aged a minimum of 4 years before release, again, taking on more of that tertiary characteristic. The classic style of making these wines is with the large Slovenian botti, the very traditional way, but producers can choose to use French or American barrique to add more spice and density to the wine. Amarone may be labeled as Classico or Valpolicella if they come from the respective areas, and Superiore, and I don't think you have an Amarone Superiore because the alcohol is already so high, but you do have, I'd have to look at that actually, but you can definitely do a Amarone della Valpolicella Reserva with that extended aging. Recioto della Valpolicella, this is the sweeter version of Amarone. So typically for Amarone, the appassamento process dries the grape for around 3 months. There's a little bit of leeway with the producer style there. Recioto della Valpolicella grapes are typically dried an additional month for around 4 months. The minimum alcohol is lower because the resulting sweetness is higher because of that more raisinating characteristic, that happens with those grapes. This is the original Valpolicella wine. Recioto was the very first wine. It's a precursor to the Amarone della Valpolicella. It's a very historical specialty of the region, but today it is a very small subset of the total production of Valpolicella wines. So what is the appassamento process? So appassamento process is the Italian term for drying the grapes. In Soave for Recioto and Valpolicella for Amarone and Recioto, the grapes are dried in fruttai. They're called fruttai. Essentially, they're these lofts or attics that help concentrate the sugar and the extract of the grape before we begin the fermentation. So the fruttai really have a unique location or unique terroir based on their location. Producers who are in, Cariano, San Pietro in Cariano will have probably more botrytis in their wines, or producers based in Negrar in the Classico region will probably have more structure and tannin because of the higher elevations and the cooler climate. The fruttai need low humidity. They're not allowed to be artificially heated. You're not allowed to artificially dry the grapes. It is a process that happens by nature, helped by man. The length of time is dependent on the appellation for both Recioto, Amarone, and then also for like Recioto di Soave. Corvina, as I mentioned, is very well suited to the appassamento process. The grape has a very, very slow dehydration, much more so than any other grape varieties that they've really tried. So Corvina really is the grape that is specifically suited to this production. As the grapes dry, not only do you increase the sugar and extract by decreasing the water in the grapes, but you also increase volatile compounds like vanilla, peppercorn, wood, bergamot, that kind of citrus you get in Earl Grey tea, smoke, earth, balsamic, and tobacco, and you lose the fresher volatile compounds. So like the rose, the fresh citrus, the clove, the herbal characteristic decrease, but you get a lot of tobacco and a lot of balsamic to the wine too. If you choose to age your Amarone or your Recioto in new American oak, you'll also begin to take on like more vanilla and cocoa and chocolate too. All right, other appellations. There are 30 DOCs and 14 DOCGs total, including what we've already discussed in the Veneto region. Most of them, I don't know if they're worth honestly even knowing about. I shouldn't say that. Everything's worth knowing about, right? But I don't know that as a consumer, it helps us to learn all of these regions because most of them we don't even see in the market here in the US. So what might you see is the top one, Gambellara DOC. It is immediately to the east of Soave. It's made in a very similar style, a minimum 80% Garganega. You can make Recioto di Gambellara from 100% Garganega. The style of Recioto can be made in a sweet still or sparkling style. The Gambellara DOC wine will be very similar to the Soave DOC wine. A favorite of mine that doesn't get mentioned too often is the Lugana DOC. It's shared with Lombardy It's at the south shore of Lake Garda. So they used to call it the Trebbiano di Lugana, but now they're calling it the Turbiana grape. They think it's much more closely related to something like Vermentino or Verdicchio. I think Verdicchio, not Vermentino, coming from like the Marche. It can be made in a Bianco, Spumante, Superiore, or Reserva style. It is a refreshing, crisp, light, what you want to drink on the shores of a lake, or on a boat on a lake type of wine, the Lugana DOC. So if you go to Lake Garda, definitely look up these wines. I think they're really perfect for the area, but they do have enough interest and structure and texture to them as well. Berganze DOC, this is a really fascinating area. Bianco is based on Thai, they call it in the area. Berganze is right up here, Lugana is right down here. Thai is Tokai Friulano. The red wines are based on Merlot or other international grape varieties. Torcolato is a specialty of the region. It's a dried grape wine made from 100% of a white grape called Vespaiolo. Fausto Maculon is the top producer that you'll see in Berganza. Bardolino and Bardolino Superiore. This sits in between Valpolicella Classico and Lake Garda. It's an extension almost of Valpolicella. The blend is the same as you see in Valpolicella. Corvina with rondinella and accessory grape varieties. They're usually lighter, fresher, a little bit more neutral than Valpolicella wines. It's a little bit flatter land going down to the lake. They make a Chiaretto style in Bardolino. So Bardolino Chiaretto Rosé. Rosso or red. They make a really interesting style called a Rosso Novello, which is made with carbonic maceration, similar to the wine coming from Beaujolais. So they're really kind of trying to push that kind of style as well. And then you also see Rosé sparkling as well. And this is just, if you guys have questions, we can get into that too. I really don't mean to keep you. We're almost 15 minutes over. So probably, does anybody have any questions? Is anybody still here? Okay, great. So just a couple, the last slides are just some top producers. I literally was like putting together these producer slides to the moment that we started class. So I didn't get as far as I would like to, but I do have several listed here. If you don't see your favorite, let me know what your favorite is. I'd love to hear from you. Giuseppe Quintarelli is considered to be one of the best producers of Valpolicella. They're recognized for their very traditional approach to winemaking. They're located in the Classico region of Valpolicella. They oftentimes declassify their wine when they don't think that they're showing as well as they should for an Amarone or a Recioto. So they have a few Veneto IGT wines, like the Rosso del Beppi, Veneto IGT, a mix of indigenous and international grape varieties. They have the Alzero, which is a blend of international red grapes. Puropan, located in Soave, founded by the Soave town doctor in 1880, still run by the family. They make a single cru Calvarino. It's a very age-worthy style of Soave. They made this at the suggestion of Luigi Veronelli, who was a very, very well-renowned Italian wine critic and collector. Luigi Veronelli was the critic and the collector that really started Super Tuscans, aside from those producers, of course, but Luigi Veronelli gave a lot of press to these Super Tuscan wines in Tuscany that really changed the course of Tuscany. And his suggestion in making this single cru wine in Soave, and I think this happened in the 70s, really changed the course of the Soave appellation too. We might not have some of these more excellent styles of wine. Del Forno Romano, if Quintarelli is the stalwart of traditionalism in Valpolicella, Romano del Forno is the kind of like the new guard, the kind of more modernist, even though he trained under Quintarelli. But this style is just more dense, austere. These are ripe grapes. He's based in Valpentina instead of Classico like Quintarelli. He does rely on using both barrique from American oak and French oak for the aging of his wines. And these wines are just really They're really beautiful. They benefit from a lot of substantial aging in the cellar, but I've had some like the Valpolicella here, Superiore, coming from like 2014, and I think it can age longer, but it can also be enjoyed if you open it up and drink it. Graziano Cross, that's what I'm drinking here, younger producer in Soave by comparison, started in 1983, does a lot of single site Soave wines. I'm drinking the Otto, which is a stainless steel production. Allegrini coming from Valpolicella. And so you can see too that a lot of these producers, like Pra makes Amarone and Valpolicella Red and Soave White. So a lot of these producers will make both. Allegrini, important one because they're a very old winery within the region, but they also, they're just sort of the force for anti-botrytis in their wines. Botrytis is something that just happens naturally with the drying process. And because of you're surrounded by water and you're close to a plain here. So botrytis is something that really happens, especially in Valpolicella and in Soave. Allegrini is really against it. So if you don't like the flavor of botrytis in your wine, you will like the Allegrini wines. They really try to keep that noble rot out of their wine. Massi is the opposite. Massi encourages botrytis in their wine. They are at the forefront of promotion of the Appassimento wine. Allegrini is really important in spearheading a move toward the Valpolicella DOC, and then releasing the non-Appassimento wine like Amarone. So these are two producers that are both considered to be some of the utmost and highest quality, but with two very different perspectives on making their wine. Inama and Soave, really fantastic producer. They do use a little bit of new oak on some of their wines, the Dulat Soave Classico, I mentioned that here. Bisol, established in 1542, really fantastic Prosecco producer, going back 21 generations within the region. They're the largest owners of Cartese, the Grand Cru. And they make this Cartese dry. You can tell I got tired of writing out Conegliano Valdobbiadene, so I just kind of shortened it here, but that's what that means. So they really make that classic style of Cartese dry that's bottled with 25 grams per liter of residual sugar. It's a very classic example. And some other great producers too. I would love to say more about all of these producers, but I ran out of time putting the slide together, and I feel like we're out of time now too. The only one I will mention really from this page is Roberta Anselmi. Roberta Anselmi was a Soave producer who in the 1970s was really unhappy with the expansion of the region and decided to leave the DOC. He declassifies all of his wines as just Veneto IGT, sorry, I spelled Veneto wrong, releases all of the wines at Veneto IGT, but it's considered to be a benchmark for the region and the Garganega grape, even though he does choose to declassify. Thanks, everybody. Monte Tondo, oh, perfect, yes, Monte Tondo, just outside of Soave. If anybody else has any suggestions, you can put them in here too. Thanks. I know that we had a big trip through the Veneto region. I'll send out some follow-up tomorrow along with the recording. You can watch it again if you missed something. And if you have any questions, please let me know. And I'll send out a few fun notes on some producers and some other information in the Veneto tomorrow. Thank you, everyone. I hope you had a good time. I hope you learned a lot. I hope you feel encouraged to seek out some really high quality producers coming from the Veneto that are really making fantastic wine. So cheers. We'll see you soon.